Did Jesus really rise from the dead, or were the disciples victims of a collective delusion? A lot of Christians say the resurrection happened because groups of people saw the risen Jesus after his death. But skeptics claim that groups of people see all sorts of things that don't exist. For example, on the Joe Rogan podcast, the intelligent design advocate Stephen Meyer brought up witnesses reporting Jesus' resurrection.
He records the basic facts of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, including being crucified under Pontius Pilate. And then that there were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole...
Right, but there's reports of Bigfoot.
Well, right, but we have...
You know?
So is the story of Jesus' resurrection a fact, or is it folklore like Bigfoot or other cases of unreliable eyewitness testimony? I'll cut to the chase. It's fact. But to see why it is, let's compare the sightings of the risen Jesus by the disciples to other strange incidents, starting with Bigfoot sightings. Most cultures have folklore about wild men or hairy men who inhabit wilderness areas, some of which may be based on encounters with hermits or feral human beings. In some of these accounts, the men are described as ape or primate-like creatures, such as the Nepalese Yeti, the Floridian skunk ape, and of course, Bigfoot, also called Sasquatch. The name Bigfoot was coined in 1958 by Northern California loggers who noticed large foot tracks in the mud that they attributed to a large creature that was doing things like moving heavy barrels around. Are sightings of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion as dismissible as sightings of Bigfoot? Even academic critics use Bigfoot sightings to reject claims about Jesus' resurrection, as can be seen in an article the late New Testament scholar Michael Golder wrote for the book Jesus' Resurrection, Fact or Figment, where he references dozens of Bigfoot sightings in South Dakota in late August of 1977. If people excited about Bigfoot could cause Bigfoot sightings to spread contagiously, then maybe the disciples who were excited about Jesus convinced each other they also saw Jesus when they really didn't. But here's where the comparison breaks down. First, we have good reason to believe sightings of creatures like Bigfoot are not genuine, because we have reason to believe Bigfoot does not exist. If Bigfoot really existed, we'd expect to find more evidence of this animal as part of the natural ecosystem. We'd expect to find, by this point, Bigfoot corpses or droppings. Since we do not find these things, we have good reason to doubt alleged Bigfoot sightings. Doubt about Bigfoot sightings comes from a lack of evidence in the ecosystem that should exist if Bigfoot were real. But since Jesus is not an unknown natural creature that lives in the woods, this objection simply doesn't apply to any sightings related to him. Number two, people are likely to say they saw Bigfoot because they were psychologically primed to see him. It was in their cultural expectation, and there are positive incentives for people who claim to have seen Bigfoot. Bigfoot was a big deal ever since the release of the 1967 Patterson-Gimli film that claimed to be a recording of him. The sightings in 1977 can be explained through cultural priming from this event, as well as the fact that in the 1970s, several movies about Bigfoot were released, including one which aired in South Dakota the summer before the outbreak of the sightings. In addition, people who claimed to see Bigfoot were given positive attention. James Stewart's academic study of the outbreak, which Golder bases his argument against Jesus on, says, seeing Bigfoot became a way of gaining prestige and living in the limelight, at least temporarily. But those elements are not present in the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. When the disciples preached that they saw the risen Jesus, the book of Acts says they received things like painful whippings, not positive reinforcement. And the disciples were not primed to think Jesus would rise from the dead. The Gospels show that the disciples did not understand Jesus' predictions, and they lost hope and were scattered after his crucifixion. And critical scholars like Bart Ehrman agree that the Jews did not have a cultural expectation of a Messiah who would die and then rise again from the dead. Death meant you were a failed Messiah. The resurrection surprised the disciples, as is evident in their initial dismissal of the woman's testimony about Jesus' empty tomb. Third, Bigfoot sightings can be explained as cases of misidentification, but the disciples would not have believed Jesus rose from the dead simply on some kind of misidentification of another person. When it comes to Bigfoot, in many cases, people misidentify natural things like shadows in the woods, an animal like a bear standing upright, other humans looking for Bigfoot, or hoaxers. In fact, decades after the name Bigfoot was coined by those California loggers, a family of one of the loggers revealed that he had used large wooden feet to create tracks that tricked his coworkers into believing in Bigfoot. Misidentification also explains other unusual sightings that are compared to the disciples seeing the risen Jesus. In a debate with William Lane Craig, atheist Keith Parsons compared the disciples seeing Jesus after death to people seeing Elvis Presley after his death.
Why are the reports of Elvis sightings material for the supermarket tabloids? Consider Elvis and Bigfoot sightings, Bermuda Triangle disappearances, alien abductions, crash saucer stories, and other such goofy legends.
But Elvis sightings are not like the disciples recognizing the risen Jesus, because Elvis sightings involve people who didn't personally know Elvis, and they also happened many years, even decades after Elvis died, whereas Jesus' disciples recognized him shortly after his death. Elvis sightings tend to be very brief encounters, where it's easy to misidentify an individual when you didn't personally know Elvis anyways, like misidentifying an Elvis impersonator as the real thing. None of that is analogous to the close disciples of Jesus spending extended periods with someone they were convinced was their rabbi who had now gloriously risen from the dead and was not some kind of Jesus impersonator, and there certainly weren't hordes of Jesus impersonators running around. Also, the disciples were convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead, not that he had simply survived death or faked his death, as eccentric Elvis fans think. And if you are a fan of this channel and podcast, don't go that far for me in becoming an eccentric fan. All I'd like you to do is just click the subscribe button and like this video. Also keep in mind that Paul's letter to the Corinthians and the Gospels describe Jesus appearing not just to individuals, but to groups of people like the 12. A group might misidentify a real thing as something else, but they're not going to all hallucinate seeing the same thing that is not there. For example, in 2006, a video went viral depicting groups of people claiming to see a leprechaun outside of Mobile, Alabama.
Curiosity leads to large crowds in Mobile's Crichton community, many of you bringing binoculars, camcorders, even camera phones to take pictures.
To me, it look like a leprechaun to me. All I gotta do is look up in the tree. Who else seen the leprechaun? Say yeah!
However, 2 radio hosts later investigated the matter and found out the source of the sightings was a man named Midget Sean, who was very short, dressed as a leprechaun to fool people.
Well, it was a real leprechaun. It was me. So then we got back down. So then I said, okay. All through the week, everybody used to come see the leprechaun, see the leprechaun, see the leprechaun.
So you actually went in the tree?
Right. We're in the tree, you know. We were just sitting down like this, like we were just sitting down. I said, okay. We were just bored, you know, we were drinking beer and stuff. So I said, we could say leprechaun.
So the group of people in that viral video did see something, but they misunderstood or misidentified what they saw in the midst of their nighttime excitement. But in order for Jesus' disciples to be motivated to believe that Jesus had gloriously risen from the dead, they could not have merely misidentified someone or something else as Jesus. A misidentification also wouldn't explain why people who didn't follow Jesus, like Paul, came to believe in Jesus' resurrection. Instead of misidentification, these people would have had to have hallucinated an encounter with Jesus, which is why many skeptics say the apostles had grief-induced hallucinations. But that still doesn't explain why Paul or Jesus' non-believing relatives like James converted. Now, some skeptics say that St. Paul felt extremely guilty about persecuting Christians, and that's why he hallucinated Jesus. But in Paul's writings, he never says he felt any guilt about his life before his conversion, and that the only reason he stopped persecuting Christians was simply because he had an encounter with the risen Jesus. A 2013 study only found one case of grief-induced hallucination involving a non-family member of the deceased, as opposed to more common subjects like spouses. So this would be something already we wouldn't expect of the disciples. And a 2020 meta-review showed that most of these cases of grief-induced hallucination only involved feeling the presence of a deceased person. Only 2% of cases involved hallucinating a tactile experience of the deceased, similar to what is described in the Gospels. And while this might be possible in really rare cases for an individual, in 2015, Dr. Joseph Bergeron surveyed thousands of cases in the medical literature and could not find a single case of a group grief hallucination comparable to the group appearances described in the New Testament. In fact, some skeptics will agree that group hallucinations are not a good explanation for the origin of the Christian faith. They instead say Christianity began with a few private hallucinations, and then the rest of the apostles developed a false memory of having seen Jesus as a group together. In his book, Jesus Before the Gospels, Bart Ehrman cites an academic study about a Boeing 747 that crashed into an apartment complex in Amsterdam in October of 1992. The study's authors asked participants almost a year after the crash, "Did you see the television film of the moment the plane hit the apartment building?" The majority in the study said they had seen the crash and even gave detailed answers about it. However, there was no film of the moment the plane hit the building. Ehrman says something like this could explain Jesus' resurrection because, quote, "This was a memory of a large group of people who all remember seeing the same thing or nearly the same thing at the same time, even though none of them saw it." But once again, this is not a group hallucination. It's not even a group misidentification. The people in the study are not saying that a group of them saw the video of the plane crash together that never actually occurred. Instead, what's happening is that lots of individuals are primed to conflate true memories. These include seeing the footage of the actual crash site, but not the crash moment, or watching wireframe or computer-generated reconstructions of the crash in news stories, or seeing footage of other airplane crashes and conflating it with this event. But that is not the same as hallucinating that something as dramatic as an airplane crash happened when there was no plane crash at all. It's completely different. Likewise, people might be a victim of a violent crime and misremember who committed the crime against them or misidentify a subject. But it would take a serious hallucination to imagine a violent attack against you happened that never actually happened. And we aren't aware of anything, especially a false memory, that can make a group of people hallucinate something like that. In fact, memory studies show that people can intently remember dramatic events years or decades after they happen. A 2005 study by Bernstein and Thompson of elderly Danish people showed they exceeded younger people at remembering things like the weather on the day Denmark was liberated from Nazi occupation 60 years earlier. Ehrman also claims this false memory of a group appearance of Jesus took root years later as the stories were told and retold among the disciples. But that ignores the fact that it was the initial claim of the resurrection after the crucifixion that prompted the disciples to stay together as a group and preach the gospel, instead of just going back to the stability of being fishermen. Something had to happen to all of them in order to cause them to be motivated to believe Jesus was not merely a person who escaped death, or even that Jesus' spirit had gone to be with Abraham in heaven. Even when people have modern grief-induced hallucinations, they still know the person is dead. They don't believe they've risen from the dead, and they eventually come to recognize they had a hallucination. At best, they might think they saw the person's ghost, and the apostles could have thought the same thing if they hallucinated Jesus, like when they thought they saw a ghost walking on the Sea of Galilee in Matthew 16. Instead, some powerful event occurred that motivated them to think that Jesus had risen bodily from the dead, and now they were motivated to go out and proclaim this truth even in the midst of persecution. Even non-Christian scholars like Paula Fredrickson admit the disciples had to have seen something to transform them into evangelists.
And over 300 years after Jesus' execution, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. 2,000 years later, Christians from all over the world venerate the place in Jerusalem where it is said Jesus rose from his tomb.
I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know, as an historian, that they must have seen something.
Finally, the disciples were in a position to know if Jesus' tomb were empty, because Jews waited up to a year to collect the bones of the deceased from tombs to place in bone boxes. And they would have seen in that tomb if they were hallucinating, because the body is there, or if the tomb was truly empty, because Jesus had risen. For more on the truth about Jesus Christ and his resurrection, check out my book, Counterfeit Christ, and I hope you have a very blessed day.